That's, I understand that.
Yeah,
That's true.
But
At this
I want
point,
everybody to know that.
I believe our speaker is here, and Lori, if you
Okay.
would like to introduce her, we're just very excited. And welcome, Jenny.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sue. That was good. I was wondering if we were ever going to get kind of into where we needed to be. So thank you. So yeah, we can talk a lot, that's for sure. So Jenny, thank you for joining us. And I want to introduce you to our indivisible group, who are all just committed, progressive, wonderful folks.
Great.
Lori?
Lori, you went dark. You gotta unmute yourself.
Lori, can you unmute yourself, please?
I don't know how that happened.
That
Okay.
was me. That was me. I did it.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. I was
Okay.
trying to mute everybody else and unfortunately muted you.
I was looking for little ghosts or something in here. So Jenny was born in Buffalo, and that would be our Buffalo, which is amazing. And then she was raised on a small farm outside of Maple Lake, and she grew up in Cokato. So when I heard about Jenny, I was like, are you serious? And we had a wonderful conversation about her growing up in this area. And after graduation, I'll warn you ahead of time, she is fearless. She moved to New York and settled in Harlem, where she earned a Black Studies and English degree. And in graduate school, she pursued a PhD with a focus on African American studies. She's a published author, an
Hold on,
editor.
Lori, I am in graduate school.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Maybe someday.
Well, she's a published author, editor, teacher, and a TV personality. And she earned an Emmy nomination when she was a TV personality. She has recently moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma, where she was recruited as a community revitalization leader in Tulsa's, I read something about this, $100 million project to improve and enhance their economic and cultural diversity. So sounds like a really interesting thing and an amazing position to be recruited to. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Jenny, and she can take the rest of this and do a much better job than I did with the introduction. But thank you so much for coming.
Oh my God, that was a great introduction and way more than I deserve. But yes, I'm a Wright County native. I was raised on a small farm in Maple Lake, and then in 6th grade, my parents moved to the edge of Cokato. I moved to Minneapolis for some years, and then when I turned 26, I moved to New York with a dream to make it in the big city. And I've been a personal trainer to women from bride to baby for more than 15 years. And, as Lori said, during my career, I was featured in a television show and earned an Emmy nomination for my starring role, which was such an honor. And then I was like, now what? So I went back to school. And I've been in school ever since, learning all about race, gender, and American Christianity. And those are sort of my focal points. I write a lot about my personal experience growing up in a fundamental religion in Wright County. I'm an ex-Lestadian, and I'm sure many of you have heard of this sect. And so it's just a very, interesting place to begin my studies and sort of like have a platform to talk about, the American experience, so to speak. I am an oral historian, and, I'm in pursuit of a PhD focusing on gender, race, but mostly race and religion, and sort of as a woman studying these things. I run a literary journal, and I work with the Leon Levy Center for Biography. And I run a podcast, a show about life writing and the people who do it, which is really fun. And I also help people fill in their knowledge gaps through a free course at blackstudies.com. And I host book clubs at several libraries in central Minnesota. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me. Today, I want to talk about some of the highlights from my Black Studies background. I think that when I got started, I didn't know who Frederick Douglass was. And I had lived on a street in Harlem that was flanked by Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard and Frederick Douglass Boulevard. And I didn't know, I had never heard of these two men, and I was 30 years old at that point. And I didn't have sort of this like mental curiosity to Google who these guys were. I just thought, well, they're probably just some like Black guys who did good. And that's what I chalked it up to. And what that says about me, you can make up your own mind. But so it's been, a progression of disillusionment for me. And so what I realized when I got my Black Studies degree was that if I never heard about these people, neither had anybody else that I grew up with. So that was alarming to me. And I decided that instead of, trying to educate people and throw things in their face, I just wanted to offer this free course to help people fill in their knowledge gaps. So we all have knowledge gaps, right? And we have tons of knowledge gaps in our Black history and really in American history, because Black history is American history. So I teach this class and so on. And it's not from a point of like do-gooder. It's more from a point of, I wish I had known. Like nobody told me, and I felt really cheated. I felt really sad that I had gone to a school of excellence, Dassel Cokato High School, and had not heard of these people. Or at least if they mentioned these names, it never like occurred to me to absorb these people. So today I'm going to share some of the highlights from my Black Studies background in chronological order from Columbus to the Civil War. And during this presentation, I hope you hear some new names and ideas that pique your curiosity and send you down your own research rabbit holes. I always love when people are like, oh, I heard about David Walker through you, and did you know? And then they point me in a direction, and it's just a whole bunch of ping-ponging of rabbit holes. I also hope to address issues that surround the Atlantic slave trade, like whose idea was it anyway? What was the first law enacted based on skin color? And what happened in the 1600s that solidified chattel slavery? And how hypocritical were the founding fathers? And what were some of the triggers to the Civil War? And what were some of the effects of the abolitionist movement? So I want to rewind us all the way back to the 1400s and the Spanish Inquisition. There's this family, the De las Casas family, and they're supposedly Jewish. This family is supposedly Jewish, and they've converted to Catholicism. Historians are sort of like vague on that, although some people are very sure that they're Jewish. And in 1502, this father and son, the son's name is Bartolome de las Casas, they sail the ocean blue, and they end up in the Caribbean. So Bartolome de las Casas was born in Seville, Spain in 1484. He died in Madrid in 1566, and he had a very remarkable life. Considering that he was, part of was possibly Jewish during the Spanish Inquisition, Jews were put to death. They were sent out of the country, or they converted. And many of them that converted to Catholicism were on the DL. They were very much like, well, we're still Jewish, but we're not telling anyone. And in 1492, when Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, many of them were on that ship. And so the De las Casas duo end up in Cuba, and they came as conquistadors. And as payment for their help in the conquest of Cuba, Bartolome de las Casas received indigenous people as his slaves. And, he was a conquistador. He participated in, island hopping and, the brutality of this era, of this time. Keep in mind that these people had been doing this to Jewish people for centuries. They had been burning them at the stake. And, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain, as a wedding present, the royal family gave them this show of of burning 20 Jewish people at the stake. That was their gift. So this was the mentality of the time in Spain. In 1515, Bartolome de las Casas had a change of heart, and we don't really know why, what changed his heart, but he gave up his slaves. He abandoned his plantation, and he began advocating to King Charles I of Spain on behalf of the rights of the natives. He was like, these are your subjects. Like, what are you doing? Like, they're dying in droves. I mean, you know, estimates are at 70 million of, you know, people that of the native people that died in the Americas. So they were dying obviously of disease and violence and overwork. So he was like, in his early writings, he was like, well, you know, let's just use Africans. They're more hardy, and let's just bring them over here. And so he appealed to the king. And, you know, later in his life, he retracted this position, but it was too late. You know, he regarded both forms of slavery as equally wrong. You know, he was a prolific writer and sort of laughed off in his last days, but, you know, he was listened to and he had some influence. And, you know, so historians say that one persistent point of criticism has been Las Casas's repeated suggestions of replacing Indians with African slave labor. Even though he repented that position later in life, some later criticism has held him responsible for the institution of the transatlantic slave trade, including David Walker, who we're going to talk about later. David Walker called de las Casas a wretch, stimulated by sordid avarice only, holding him responsible for the enslavement of thousands of Africans. And the historian Sylvia Winter argues that Las Casas 1516 memorial was the direct cause of Charles V granting permission in 1518 to transport the first 4,000 African slaves to Jamaica. So thanks to de las Casas' letter to the king, 4,000 African slaves were kidnapped and brought to Jamaica. So we can't blame one person, but we can sort of like find that origin of that idea. By 1619, pirates sell 20 Angolan slaves to Jamestown, and they are labeled lower on the human scale than white indentured servants. So now we have, you know, enslaved people coming to the Caribbean in droves, thanks to Europeans. And the Atlantic slave trade is really underway. And I will refer you to, there's a 2-minute video that you can watch online. Slate does a really good job, slate.com. It just depicts all of the slave ships that come from Western Africa to the Americas. And you can click on any one of the dots and it'll give you information about each of the ships, how many people died coming over. And in the early years, more than 50% of the people that boarded the ships in Africa died before they reached the Americas. So the conditions were that horrible. And so when we say, you know, there were 12 million Africans that came to the Americas, that is grossly underestimated, because we know that many ships were not documented. We know that many ships sank or people jumped overboard. And so we don't, you know, one of my professors was like, oh, it's upwards of 50 million. And, you know, she is a world-renowned historian. So, I mean, I believe her, you know. So anyway, I'll post that link in the Q&A later. But I want to now like touch on what makes a society with slaves versus a slave-based society. So in his book, Generations of Captivity, the late historian Ira Berlin writes about economic structures with slaves. So he's like, okay, there are two types of slave societies. There's a society with slaves, and then there's a slave society, or, you know, a society based in slavery. So a society with slaves is one in which slaves exist. Indeed, that men and women are owned, but they're able to trade independently on their own lives and have religious and family autonomy, right? You know, and the reason for them having this autonomy is that it's dangerous to push people to the brink. You know, there's no telling when an enslaved person might decide that it's not worth it, and they'll begin to push back and rebel, right? So slaveholders didn't want to be in this precarious position. And we don't have to look any further than, say, ancient Rome, where, you know, there were many slaves, but being born a slave did not necessarily mean that your great-grandchildren would be enslaved. You were just sort of absorbed into society. Same thing on the continent of Africa. A village would be invaded, and if it was your village, you became enslaved by the invaders, right? And then eventually you're absorbed into that community and you move on with your life. But so Roman society and societies that were societies with slaves were not centered around slavery. Rather, you know, they just, you know, enslaved people sort of like, you know, were part of the family in a sense. You know, we can also look at Virginia in the first half of the 1600s. There was a certain amount of freedom to the enslaved people. We can look at a historical figure named Anthony Johnson, who arrived in 1522 and worked his way up to owning slaves himself. And in his lifetime, he bought and sold both Black and white people. And at the end of his life, he lost all of his wealth, and that was it. And that was the end of his lineage, or his, you know, passing wealth on to his children. They did not inherit his wealth because of the color of their skin. His name is Anthony Johnson. So, you know, court records, he takes people to court for, like, he'll take a runaway slave to court and be like, you're my slave, like, you can't run away. And so we know about Anthony Johnson because of these court records. And so, and we also know that Anthony Johnson was a slave himself. And so we know that slaves were able to get free. So, you know, we can talk about this like U-shape in our history where Black people or African people were free and could, you know, or, you know, they had rights, they had property rights and so on. And we know what happened. And I don't know if we're back at that place yet on the other side of this U. And now let's talk about a slave society. So when there's a commodity that's very profitable, such as like sugar, tobacco, or cotton, something that has a strong profit motive, slavery becomes the overwhelming institution that shapes economic and social life and shapes the norms and practices in a civil society. And the 1619 Project by the New York Times, Nicole Hannah-Jones talks about this very thing, how in the United States, slaves were worth more than the railroads and factories combined, which I found to be very shocking. Additionally, in a slave society, there exists this strong belief, or almost a conviction, that enslaving people is the right thing to do, and slavery is the proper way to structure a society. And that just seems very familiar to my understanding of American slavery. So in the first half of the 17th century, Africans and Europeans worked together on the frontier. They didn't really have much social distancing. And I don't mean that in COVID times. I mean, they were very much living amongst each other and intermarrying and creating this like almost a new race of people that might call themselves Creole people, or people that are living sort of in the margins, in the racial margins. Although at that time, it wasn't really like, you know, it wasn't really like this racial hierarchy as opposed to a religious hierarchy. People were really obsessed with what religion were you, and were you Christian? And that sort of determined your enslavement as well. But this transition begins in the middle of the 1600s. Certain drivers for this switch from, tipping the balance for African people were a change in labor supply and the need for workers, really. England was experiencing a plague in the 1660s. So, they were losing people. The Great London Fire had created new jobs at home, right? So there were jobs to be had. So they were like, well, we don't need to go to the colonies. And let's see, I just lost my spot. And less people were willing to go to the colonies because of the postal service. Word traveled back to England. If you came to the colonies and you experienced starvation and all these harsh treatments that we've all heard about, you're going to send a letter back, or you're going to send word back with, cousin Sammy, like, yo, it sucks here. Don't come, or send money and get me back, and Africans couldn't do that. There was no postal service. There was nobody going back to Africa with a message for mom and dad. That was not happening. So simultaneously, you have, this drying up of workers in London, in England, really, or in Europe. And you have this sort of like a steady stream of Africans coming into the Caribbean working on these plantations, right? And so the other thing is the native populations here was decreasing, as we know, from warfare and disease, and also their home. They're like, you can't enslave me. I know this land better than you. I'm not going to fall for that. So Africans begin to feel this need for increasing labor shortages. Enslavement sort of sets a precedent because of this Atlantic slave trade. And by the 1670s and 1680s, the planter class begins to really accumulate wealth, and they begin to buy enslaved people from Africa and the Caribbean. Simultaneously, Africans begin to experience an erosion of rights. So I told you about Anthony Johnson, right? So Anthony Johnson in his lifetime experienced this U-shape, or this sort of, actually the first part of the U, like this downward spiral of rights, or almost, well, he started out enslaved. You do the math. I count to 10 for a living. So by the time the 1640s rolls around, so the first, the quote unquote stowaways from Angola in 1619, the enslaved people arrive. 21 years later, in 1640, John Punch, it becomes the first sort of indentured or enslaved person to be enslaved for life because of the color of his skin. So it was John Punch and these two other white dudes who are enslaved by the same person, or the same quote unquote master. And they run away. They're like, this sucks. Let's get out of here. So they run away, they get caught, they get, they get brought to court, and the two white guys have to serve 6 months more of their servitude, or a year more of their servitude. But John Punch has to serve the rest of his life as a slave because of the color of his skin. So that's really the first law that we know of that's based on the color of someone's skin. And that starts in 1640. By 1662, there's a change in inheritance law. So, up in it's almost like, well, we'll just go English history, because we were by and large an English colony. Until the 1600s, you inherited the status of your father, right? But by 1662, there's a change in this inheritance law. It begins in Virginia and spreads throughout the colonies, basically saying that we're going to change the law from the father to the mother to establish this hereditary racial slavery and to enslave generations. And there was a financial reward for relations upon Negro women. This is in 1662. By 1664, miscegenation is banned, so interracial relationships. And so, anyway, that would take me down a whole rabbit hole just to explain that one. In 1667, Virginia declares Christian baptism will not alter the status of an enslaved person. So until then, you could just convert to Christianity and get free. Like everyone was doing it. So why not? But this all like, you know, the jig was up in 1667. In 1668, New Jersey passes the first fugitive slave laws. By 1670, Virginia free blacks and Indians could no longer keep Christian and white servants. So this law tells us that they had white servants. So that tells us a lot by the sheer wording of this law. And then in 1688, you have sort of the first people speaking out against slavery. So Germantown petition against slavery states, this Germantown petition against slavery, Mennonites disavow slavery and cite the Golden Rule. So it was the Mennonites, not the Quakers, that stood up against slavery first. And they said that in Europe, there are many oppressed for their religion. And here those are oppressed for their black color. Both are wrong. Africans have the right to fight for their freedom. Not to be free, but they have the right to fight for their freedom. That's an interesting choice of words, I think. So how did we go from a colonial society with slaves to a slave society? This is where I would like open the floor for discussion, but I'll just answer my own question. Greed. By the 18th century, people were treated as property, and colonial America had turned into a chattel slavery society. Okay, so it was really during the 1600s that this all took place. The biggest turning point, I would say, in the 1600s, I mean, it's arguable, and you could push back on me and I would probably say yes and. But the biggest turning point was Bacon's rebellion. So Africans and Europeans are working together in the fields under these harsh conditions, and they're like, dude, this sucks. So they band together against the planter class. And they grossly outnumber the wealthy, right? So seeing them united in a cause alarms the ruling class. They're like, dude, we're in trouble. So historians believe that the rebellion hastened the hardening of racial lines associated with slavery. Sort of as a way for planters in the colony to control some of the poor, the planter class gave advantages to white workers and less to black workers. So white dude gets 25 cents an hour, black dude gets 5 cents an hour. We're gonna put latrines in the housing of the white people. Black people usually you have to use the tree out back, right? And so this creates, you know, division among the working class, right? This inequality. And then, you know, I would also argue that, you know, there's so many things happening simultaneously. And we have to remember that none of this, you know, happens in a bubble. It's like there's all kinds of stew happening, right? So we're entering this Enlightenment period in Europe where there's this greater intellectual movement, there's pseudoscience and these scientific discoveries happening. And in 1735, this Swedish scientist, Carl Linnaeus, decides like, oh, there's a total human hierarchy. So he establishes this human hierarchy with Europeans on the top and Africans on the bottom. And this sets the scientific stage for more than a century, much more than a century. I mean, we could argue that it's still in effect, its effects are still felt today. In 1774, there's this idea of polygenesis, or Black people are actually a different species. Okay, so this, you know, Carl Linnaeus kind of like sets off this snowball of pseudoscience, right? By 1815, you have Sarah Baartman, who is objectified for her buttocks. She's from South Africa, and she's paraded around Europe in a freak show. So she's paraded, around for like 2-ish years. There's a really incredible play about her called Venus Hottentot, written by, I forgot. It'll come to me. So her body is sort of seen as a foundation for scientific racism. She ended up dying in the care of her owner, and he dissected her body and preserved her body parts in formaldehyde. And she was on display at the Natural History Museum in Paris until the 1970s. And then finally, her remains were reunited back in South Africa, I think in 2002. Yeah. In the 1840s, we have Dr. Marion Sims, who's the father of gynecology. And he's like, Black people don't feel pain. They're of a different species than us. So he performed surgical techniques and perfected his surgical techniques on enslaved Black women without anesthesia. And he practiced on one enslaved woman more than 30 times. So, and his statue was just taken down in Central Park a couple years ago. And then, I just have another note here. In 1776, this goes with the Mennonite thing, the Quakers banned slave ownership in 1776. So I know that's like a non sequitur. Sorry, I just had it in my notes. My bad. So let's talk a little bit about pushback on American slavery. So you have the founding fathers, calling Black people 3/5 of a person so that, there's representation in Washington for slaveholders and, the economic engine is propped up. And so we have this country that's a slave society. Its wealth is from slavery. It's based in slavery. And remember, we talked about like this fear of rebellion. If you push people to the brink, they're going to do something about it. Well, we've heard of Denmark Vesey, and we've heard of Nat Turner, and we've heard of the Haitian Revolution. But there were more than 313 slave rebellions that we know of. And a slave rebellion is sort of classified as 10 or more slaves with freedom as the apparent aim, right? And so, some of those are like the Stono Rebellion of 1739. I think that was the biggest one. Gabriel's Conspiracy of 1800, Denmark Vesey in 1822, Nat Turner in 1831, and so on. So, people were rebelling. I mean, there were like individual rebellions or rebellions of like only 5 people. It was happening all the time, especially when word got out about the Haitian Revolution in 1804. It was the only successful slave revolt. And their history is incredible. I highly recommend, if you want recommendations on books on any of this stuff, let me know. But the Haitian Revolution is amazing. And Toussaint Louverture led the revolution, and there are several biographies about him. In fact, one just came out that I highly recommend. It's The Black Spartacus. Okay, so the Haitian Revolution sort of like spread fear in the United States and actually like all over the slaveholding world, really. White slaveholders were, like locking their doors. They were afraid. And the reason we know this is in private letters to one another. They would talk about their fear of, enslaved people. They would sell them off, if they really feared someone, right? And then we can talk about sort of the Missouri Compromise of 1820. The Missouri Compromise was really like a contentious issue, and I'm not going to go into it too deeply, but if you don't know anything about it, I'll just give you a quick overview. So Missouri was coming into the United States, and it was above the Mason-Dixon line, and then Maine was coming into the United States. And in order to balance the power in Washington, Missouri came in as a slave state, Maine came in as a free state. And Thomas Jefferson, you know, and it was not pretty. It was a fight in Washington, and Thomas Jefferson predicted a civil war. He wrote a letter to one of his friends, and he was like, "We're in trouble," and he was right, you know. And we'll talk about that, about triggers to the Civil War, and the Missouri Compromise is one of them. There's also this uptick in racial tensions in the 1820s. I'm trying to build you up to one of my favorite historical figures. So in the 1820s, up until the 1820s, there were maybe hundreds of thousands, I don't want to say millions, because I don't think it was millions, of free Black people living throughout the United States. And the United States was very small. And they could own property in many states. They could vote. You know, they were discriminated against in different ways, but they could still own property and vote in many places, in many places, I should say. So in the 1820s, you know, the Missouri Compromise is passed, and there's sort of this uptick in, like, you know, this racial violence, race riots. I wonder if there was a pandemic before that, because there was a pandemic in 1918, and then the 1920s were a huge uptick in the Ku Klux Klan as well. And look at where we are now. So the 1820s had race riots in New York City, New Haven, Boston, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh. This is when the American Colonization Society is established to send free Blacks back to Africa. And this is also in 1824 when white Jesus sort of comes on the scene. And when I say white Jesus, I mean a European Jesus that sort of unites Christian America. And Ibram X. Kendi writes about it in his book, Stamped from the Beginning, about how, you know, he went into the archives, and an enslaved person had said that he thought that his master was God and his master's son was Jesus because they were white. So there was this, you know, this sort of, like, you know, propaganda, if you will, starting in the 1820s. So by the end of the 1820s, many states said that free Black people could not own property or vote. And so if you were a free Black person, you were like, wait a minute, I see where this is going, right? So I want to talk about David Walker. David Walker is one of my favorite people of all time. I want to write a biography of him. There is none. I discovered him in one of my undergraduate classes pretty early on in my studies, and he's fascinated me ever since. David Walker was born in 1796 or 1797. We don't know. He was born in Wilmington, North Carolina. He was born to a free mother and an enslaved man who died before he was born. He never met his father. And he died in Boston in 1830. So he was a very young man. But he was born free, and he witnessed firsthand the brutality of slavery. So as you can imagine, you know, his father was a slave, so he must have lived, you know, very closely with the slave community in North Carolina, in Wilmington. And so, you know, one of his friends, he watched one of his friends was forced to whip his own mother to death. This kid was forced to whip his mother until she died. And that had a profound effect on David Walker for the rest of his life. He said that if he had to continue living there, he would have ended his own life. He couldn't live there anymore. So he traveled throughout the country, which was, again, very small at that time. And he settled in Boston, and he set up a used clothing store in the 1820s near the port. And he was a writer, he was part of the AME church. He was, he was a writer, he was an orator. And he joined the anti-slavery societies and became involved with the first African-American newspaper called the Freedom's Journal in New York City. He was a contributor. So he was living in Boston, but he was contributing to this newspaper. By 1828, he became the lead spokesman against slavery. I mean, that's pretty incredible. So at the time in the 1820s, the abolitionist movement was sort of like, well, let's just appeal to people's like better sides. Let's gradually emancipate the slaves like we did in the North, even though we could get into that whole thing at some point. But, people were just like lackadaisical about, those slaves in the South. They were like, well, we'll just maybe send them off someplace or just gradually free them. But it was not this urgent thing. And David Walker was like, hell no, right? He was like, he was setting out to make a change. And again, we're talking about a very genteel time in history where nobody's really outspoken. Like Olaudah Equiano has written his slave narrative and he's appealing to Christianity. And he's like, I was saved, I came here and I was saved, And David Walker is like, So in September of 1829, he publishes this appeal. And he makes friends with these sailors and he starts to sew this appeal into the lining of their clothing so that these appeals make their way south, on these ships. And his audience really was Black people across the slaveholding world, but mainly in the South. He was like, I want Black people to read my appeal. And so he distributes it to the South and it starts causing ripples. To say that David Walker's appeal made a huge impression on the South is to understate the effect of David Walker's appeal. Slaves were inspired with pride and hope. They were like, yo, this guy is saying something, like, we need to listen. White people were horrified, scared out of their minds. They offered $3,000 for his death or $10,000 for his capture and transport south, 3 different states. Georgia, Louisiana, and North Carolina passed legislation making it a crime to teach slaves, or any Blacks for that matter, to read and write because of David Walker's appeal. Eventually, all southern states, except for 3 border states, passed the same legislation. Okay, so this is now a cascade effect because of this crazy appeal. These states also severely limited civil liberties. Freedom of the press, speech, and petitions to Congress were limited during this time. It became known as the gag rule. I think we've heard of the gag rule. All because of this appeal. People were very afraid of slave insurrections. And I want to say a couple more things before I move on to the next thing I wanted to say. So in his appeal, he mixes the Old Testament liberation theology with natural rights in the Declaration of Independence. So he's like, let me read the Bible, let me read the Constitution, and let me like marry these 2 documents. So, and then he looks at Jefferson's language about the right of revolution. And he's like, yeah, the Bible also says that, God intervenes on behalf of his people and overturns society. And I'm God's people. So this society is going to be overturned. He warns the US that if they don't change, God's going to destroy the nation. He says that the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution are the source of founding creeds for Black abolitionists. In other words, we don't need any more documents. We have them. They're here. Like we are citizens, like we are Americans. So he places Black people in the language of Jefferson's first principles of the document, especially the right to revolution. And so he gives Black people the permission to revolt. He's like, you're obligated to. So if the 1820s anti-slavery movement was moderate and cautious, those who opposed, this gradual emancipation nonsense, Walker broke with that tradition, and he was the first one to do so. He was the OG Malcolm X. He called for immediate abolition. He condemned colonization. He said that Black people are Americans and they deserve full citizenship. He used rhetoric from the nation, liberty, equality, Declaration of Independence. I know I keep saying that, but he also threw in the face of white America, charging them as hypocrites and violating their professed ideals. He drew on Christianity, how slavery is a sin against God, and the nation would suffer. His appeal was uncompromising. He used radical language that's radical today. Today. You read it today and you go, dude, this guy is like radical. He was not cautious. He condemned the complicity of the entire institutional structure of the United States, and he led the abolitionist movement. He galvanized the Black community. He was found dead less than a year later in his doorway, and the official cause of death was tuberculosis, even though there's no evidence he had it. So he was probably poisoned, but I'll find out, I hope. So he inspired William Lloyd Garrison, and William Lloyd Garrison actually credits David Walker for his start. William Lloyd Garrison publishes The Liberator in Boston in 1831. And he also inspired Nat Turner, who led a rebellion in 1831. So these people read the appeal and they were like, and they cite David Walker's appeal for their actions. I would argue that David Walker inspired Frederick Douglass, inspired Ida B. Wells, who inspired W.E.B. Du Bois. I mean, I'm not saying that these people inspired each other, but I would say that David Walker inspired this radical thought. If you've ever read Frederick Douglass's speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, that's David Walker. That's very much David Walker. David Walker didn't write it, but it's inspired by David Walker. Malcolm X, I mean, Thurgood Marshall, who we're gonna learn about a little bit later, maybe if we have time. So David Walker had a son, Edward G. Walker, who was born after David died, and he became a lawyer. He was nominated to be a judge 3 times, but Republicans rejected his nomination, and he ended up eventually being elected to Massachusetts state legislature, but he never had any kids. So David Walker's lineage is over. Anyway, so I'm not going to get into William Lloyd Garrison because I think Frederick Douglass is a much more interesting character, and you can learn about him, I think, on your own because he's amazing. I wanted to sort of touch on the Underground Railroad started in 1810 and it went to my notes say 1850. We can just agree that it probably went to 1860, but my notes say 1850. 100,000 slaves leave the South via the Underground Railroad. And there are so many interesting people outside of Harriet Tubman who, I mean, she's a very interesting hero, but there are so many wonderful people that I've discovered along my studies that are equally impressive and remarkable. And, you know, it was a huge operation, but it was obviously very hush hush. And, you know, people did not out themselves, you know, if they worked with the Underground Railroad. And that was sort of all part of this bigger abolitionist movement. I want to kind of get into some of these laws, though. I think I'm trying to prioritize my time here for a second. Okay, I'm just going to get into the Civil War triggers because I think some of these laws will be pulled out in this next section. So we can talk about like some of the triggers of the Civil War. Like I would argue that the John Punch Law was a Civil War trigger, but the United States was not established yet. So I will say that the first trigger to the Civil War was probably the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, because it did not include women. It did not include Black people. In fact, they were, 3/5 of a person. We talked about the Missouri Compromise. Okay, some other triggers of the Civil War. Obviously, we talked about the Missouri Compromise. I would say that slavery itself is a trigger of the Civil War. The Missouri Compromise, as Thomas Jefferson predicted. The Nat Turner Rebellion, of course, David Walker's appeal. The Nat Turner Rebellion was in 1831 and 60 white people were killed. We could get into, the Native American situation as well, but I think you guys have a really, good person to teach you about that stuff in the 1830s with Andrew Jackson. So I'm not going to get into that. The 1850 Compromise, right? So the Fugitive Slave Act, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin is a really interesting story. So there was this guy, Josiah Henson, who escaped slavery and walked 6,000 miles to freedom to Canada with his wife and kids. And he became a preacher and a writer and an abolitionist speaker. And he came to the United States many times to join Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison and others on the speaking circuit. And he had just published his slave narrative, of which there were hundreds of slave narratives, not just Frederick Douglass or Sojourner Truth. And this woman had read his narrative and she was like, I want to meet this guy. Like she was so devastated by this fugitive slave law because it was violating her rights as a white person, right? So at some point, these laws that were enacted were infringing on white people's rights. And they were like, we need to abolish this because now I am being fined for this craziness. Like I'm getting wrapped up in it. Because the North was pretty much like, that's your problem. Like, it's not my problem, like whatever. Until it became a problem, right? And so this woman, Harriet Beecher Stowe, was like, I got to meet this Josiah Henson character. So she goes to meet him in Boston and he tells her his story. And so she bases Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom is Josiah Henson's character. She doesn't like give him any money. She makes she's like a bestseller. It's like the best-selling book of all time. And it's based on this other guy's story. Anyway, crazy. But her story, her book, came out in 1852, in March of 1852, and it really humanized enslaved people. Obviously, it shed a spotlight on Black people as empathetic and having feelings and believing in God and Jesus and all of that stuff. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was another trigger to the Civil War. They were going to come into the Union by popular sovereignty. In other words, let the people vote whether they want slavery or not. And so it became known as Bloody Kansas because, John Brown and others went to the state of Kansas to become voters, and they ended up fighting with each other over slavery. And so you already have people fighting about slavery before the Civil War even starts, right? Of course, in 1857, the Dred Scott case, He is not a citizen. In fact, he's just a piece of property. He's like a piece of paper. Like you can't rule on the freedom of a piece of paper when it's just a piece of paper, right? So this decision, this Supreme Court decision in 1857, it was like a total conundrum for all these people who, like, it just became like a real problem. Like such a, again, that's another rabbit hole and I'm running out of time. But, you know, it just basically made it difficult to regulate like people by the federal government, right? And then, of course, there were the Lincoln-Douglas debates. There were 7 debates that Lincoln and his opponent Douglas debated 7 times on the topic of slavery. In 1859, John Brown raids Harper's Ferry, Virginia. It's put down by Robert E. Lee. He is hanged for treason. And then Lincoln is elected, and then 11 Southern states secede from the Union, and then Fort Sumter. The first battle is at Fort Sumter. That's all I will say about that. And then I don't know if everybody has read or heard about Thurgood Marshall's 1987 speech on the bicentennial of the United States. I didn't talk about the Declaration of Independence because I wanted to talk about this speech. Has anybody read Thurgood Marshall's 1987 speech on the bicentennial of the United States? I hadn't either. Okay, so I just want to go through some highlights because I think it's really fascinating and timely. And it speaks to a lot of the things that I've been talking about today. So he writes, 1987 marks the 200th anniversary of the United States Constitution. A commission has been established to coordinate the celebration. The official meetings, essay contests, and festivities have begun. The planned commemoration will span 3 years, and I am told 1987 is dedicated to the memory of the founders and the document they drafted in Philadelphia. We are to, quote, recall the achievements of our founders and the knowledge and experience that inspired them, the nature of the government they established, its origins, its character, and its ends, and the rights and privileges of citizenship as well as its attendant responsibilities, unquote. Like many anniversary celebrations, the plan for 1987 takes particular events and holds them up as the source of all the very best that has followed. Patriotic feelings will surely swell, prompting proud proclamations of the wisdom, foresight, and sense of justice shared by the framers and reflected in a written document now yellowed with age. This is unfortunate, not the patriotism itself, but the tendency for the celebration to oversimplify and overlook the many other events that have been instrumental to our achievements as a nation. The focus of this celebration invites a complacent belief that the vision of those who debated and compromised in Philadelphia yielded to the more perfect union it is said we now employ. I cannot accept this invitation, for I do not believe that the meaning of the Constitution was forever fixed at the Philadelphia Convention, nor do I find the wisdom, foresight, and sense of justice exhibited by the framers particularly profound. To the contrary, the government they devised was defective from the start, requiring several amendments, a civil war, and a momentous social transformation to attain the system of constitutional government and its respect for the individual freedoms and human rights we hold as fundamental today. When contemporary Americans cite the Constitution, they invoke a concept that is vastly different from what the framers barely began to construct 2 centuries ago. For a sense of the evolving nature of the Constitution, we need to look no further than the first 3 words of the document's preamble, "We the people." When the founding fathers used this phrase in 1787, they did not have in mind the majority of America's citizens. We the people included, in the words of the framers, the whole number of free persons. On a matter so basic as the right to vote, for example, Negro slaves were excluded, although they were counted for representational purposes at 3/5 each. Women did not gain the right to vote for over 130 years. These omissions were intentional. The record of the framers' debates on the slave question is especially clear. The Southern states seceded to the demands of the New England states for giving Congress broad power to regulate commerce in exchange for the right to continue the slave trade. The economic interests of the regions coalesced. New Englanders engaged in the carrying trade would profit from the transporting slaves from Africa, as well as goods produced in America by slave labor. The perpetuation of slavery ensured the primary source of wealth in the Southern states, and so on and so forth. I've run out of time, but I highly recommend this speech because he just gives it to us. That's the tweet. That's all I got.
Jenny, thank you so much. If you have questions for Jenny, you want to unmute yourself and maybe wave at her, and we can oopsie, I've got to get out of my view here. If you have a question, you can write it in the chat or give a wave.
I'm curious, Jenny, what are you doing exactly in Tulsa?
Great question. So I moved to Tulsa on February 20. I'm actually in New York City right now. I'm in Brooklyn of all things. I flew back here to get my dog. She's over there. But I am in Tulsa because the race riot anniversary is on May 31st and June 1st. And I want to do some research behind the scenes. I want to learn what they're doing to tell the story. And so I've volunteered at the local historical society. I want to work in their archives. When I went to the historical society, it's very whitewashed. The story is it's not told in the detail that like it deserves to be told, right? They don't say fire bombs were dropped on the Black community. They just said it was burned to the ground. Well, we need the whole, let's just tell the truth, right? So, I've always been of the opinion that the truth shall set you free. So I've begun by volunteering with the Historical Society. I'm also working with the local community. I like to work with kids. And so I'm doing some literacy stuff with kids, helping teach them how to read. Of course, this is all volunteer. And of course, I just kind of want to immerse myself in the local, rebuilding of Greenwood. So there are these organizations that are physically rebuilding Greenwood, right? But then there's a community building, right? There are several community organizations that are helping to build, another Black Wall Street, but not really. They're sort of trying to revitalize Black Tulsa. It's really North Tulsa. So it's just a very interesting time to be in Tulsa. It's an exciting time to be there. And I don't exactly know what I'm going to get involved in yet, but I know some people. So we'll see. Ping me in a month. Ping me in a month.
Jenny, I'd be interested if you had a list of books or readings that you think, I know you've referenced a few, but I didn't write things down fast enough. If you have a list of things, if you could send them to us that we could post for our members to read and to look at, I would appreciate that.
Of course.
Other questions for Jenny? You got to be tired.
Mhm.
That's a lot of information. Wow.
I think Wendy's got one. I see your hand.
I
Hey
have some
there.
private messages.
I so appreciate your storytelling. You're an excellent storyteller. That's the way I like to learn history. I listened to Chris Lehman, a professor over at St. Cloud State, has some history books out now. And I listened to him speak, and he was telling us that in Minnesota, we had slaves when it was a territory, before it was a state. Can you give us a little insight on that?
I know that what's his name? I'm like,
Red Scott.
thank you. Wow. Yeah, he was in Minnesota.
Yeah.
I don't know the extent of slavery in Minnesota before it was a state. I don't know.
Well,
I mean,
St. Cloud,
I know a lot of history about, so my project is actually on Scandinavian immigrants in northern Minnesota in, the early 1900s. That's what my master's thesis is about. So I know a lot about that. And I know what I inherited as a result of that. But I don't
Jenny,
know about slavery
in St. Cloud, the Mississippi tea planters had such a strong economic presence that they had special laws passed to enable the summering Mississippi planters to bring slaves with them and protect their ownership by local laws. And in the Civil War, St. Cloud was very well split between the pro-South and the Union, and it reflected. As you know, Minnesota has a rich history of racism, and St. Cloud was certainly in the thick of it.
still is.
Yes.
There is a book out called Slavery's Reach, and I cannot remember the author, but
That's Chris Lehman's book.
yes, thank you.
Yes.
Yep, and that addresses slavery in Minnesota.
Ooh, I can't wait to read it. It sounds fascinating. There's another, I Hope I Join the Band is the name of the book. The author is, she was a professor, or she got her PhD, I think, at St. Cloud State. No, she went to St. Cloud State. She's from Minnesota. She's a professor in Iowa now. What is her name? The book is called I Hope I Join the Band. It's on critical race theory, which is also something that I'm heavily studying. It's an incredible book. It's sort of non-academic in a way that it's an easy read, like it's a narrative. It's a memoir about her family's experience adopting an Indian boy, her brother, but he had parents. It was a way of whitewashing the local Indian population. So she writes about it. I Hope I Join the Band. Oh, Condon. Her last name is Condon, Condon. I'll send it out. I'll add it to my list. What else? I see I have some direct messages, but I don't know if they're questions.
I was going to say I think American Experience had a segment on the Tulsa massacre.
Mm-hmm. It's really well done.
Yeah.
Yeah. I printed out, so I teach these classes, right? And I printed out just for scope and size of race riots in this country. My favorite era to teach really is the redemption. So after Reconstruction through the 1930s. Anyway, I just printed out race riots from 1900 to 1920.
Wow.
Yeah. 3 pages.
Race riots. That's insane, right? That's insane. Yeah.
We didn't really get a chance to talk about it, but last night, I think it was on CNN, but it was about the Ku Klux Klan. And that also, I think, is a really interesting time in history with, the bombings of the church with the little girls that died and things like that. It's a sad history, but it's also a really a fascinating history and how they could become so powerful and the whole process of sort of taking them down. So anyway, we didn't get time for that, but I do think that that's another, if there's something that that was written about that or something, I just find that to be a both tragic, but yet also inspirational, because they finally started getting empowered enough to go after the Klan and put them away, the ones that were doing the things at that time.
The Klan has a very, for lack of a better term, rich history in Minnesota. Somebody wrote a dissertation on the Klan in northern Minnesota between like 1900 and 1930. It's devastating. The Klan infiltrated every single county in Minnesota during this time. Every single county. I was like, what? I don't know. And you know, and in my memoir or in my thesis, I write, I don't know, I don't have proof that my grandparents were Ku Klux Klan holding card holding members. But what I do know is that the ideals that were passed down to me are very similar to that era. When I studied the Ku Klux Klan of Minnesota in the early 1900s, that fear built in me at a very young age. The most comforting, loving moments of my life, being rocked, like being read a book on the wooden rocking chair on the farm in Maple Lake. My dad is reading to me from Uncle Remus, and our dog Sambo is barking outside. That's a very loving and intimate moment. Right? Or when I'm eating breakfast, food is so comforting, especially breakfast is so like, I don't know, like it's so delicious. And there's Aunt Jemima syrup and there's like, Uncle Ben's rice, or there's like the cream of wheat guy, that cream of wheat guy, all of those things like that. Just, I look at like the most like loving, like most comfortable, like sweet times in my life where I feel like safe. And there's that thing. That's what
I can't thank you enough for all the information tonight. And not just that, but the questions and the things that are going to push us to read more and find out more. We do need to wrap up this evening tonight. So thank you. Really appreciate your time and having you here.